to make this talk at the end of my PhD because I had a postdoc lined up, so I feel like this is all retribution, and then I'll be free of all my debts from UCLA after today. So yeah, I'll be talking about the evolution and ontogeny or development of ethno-linguistic reasoning. This is a picture that's the only good picture I've ever taken from my field site that I'll come back to later to try to convince you that this was a really great context in which to study some of these questions. But I decided I wanted to start with something that primatologists and linguists in the department often do, which is video evidence. And I don't have great video evidence, but it's often so compelling. This is not my data, but hopefully it will stimulate some, or justify some of the questions that I want to ask today. So,
you told me I can do whatever I want, but I can't be a black woman. I can't be a black woman grow up.
What do you want to call it?
A rapper police woman.
You can be a white girl and be a rapper too.
No, I'm not gonna lose. I'm not gonna lose for you. I want to be a black police woman that raps.
Well, that you can't be a black girl if you're a white girl. It's the way God made you, but you can be a white girl who raps. But you can't be a black girl because God made you a white girl.
she's not having it.
That's not mine.
There's a final negation that this is going to be a constraint in her life.
Are you okay with that?
No. Okay. So it's amusing, and it's interesting why it's amusing as well, right? But for now, I just want to use this as motivation for kind of recognizing all being on the same page, that not all social categories are thought of similarly. We had being a woman, being black, being a rapper, and being a policewoman, right? They had different affordances. Children's expectations may not coincide with adults' expectations about these social categories. Socialization is happening here, although maybe not very effectively. But for example, through label use, so even within the police versus rapper context, like there's some evidence that saying police woman as opposed to a rapper versus a person who raps has different kinds of information for kids in terms of what it means about being a category that's rich in inductive potential or meaningful. So rappers, it being a label of a rapper actually has more information, or kids think that that has more information than a person who raps. And then finally, hopefully I'll have time at the end to talk about a meta-analysis I'm working on that addresses a specific question that's flying out there in the literature of whether certain category boundaries that are characterized by morphological differences, like being black, for example, might be thought of as special to the human mind, okay? And here it seems like maybe not, right? Like maybe it is, but only among adults and not among kids. But that's just anecdata. So we have some cross-cultural data on that question. Okay, but my larger enterprise is motivated by this observation that humans universally as a species, universally but also uniquely as a species, categorize themselves, live in ethnic groups. And for the purpose of this talk, by ethnic groups, I just mean symbolically markers of people who share cultural attributes, institutions, perhaps some norms or skills, for example. And so by this very minimal definition, we could include religious groups, subgroups in large nation states like punk, nation states, in addition kind of to the more traditional social categories or tribal units that anthropologists in the mid-20th century and earlier tended to study. And this is a really different picture. This is a really different environment than what our closest relatives have. They do live in social groups, but they're not marking themselves. And there is some cultural differences that seem to actually possibly be matrilineally inherited rather than group level inherited in a lot of apes. But it's unclear that they use this to make social decisions about the world. Okay. So this picture suggests that in addition to the vast ecologically different environments that we've had to adapt to, living in tundras, living in deserts, we've also had to adapt to a really diverse kind of social ecology, specifically here with respect to cultural group boundaries. Okay, so rough schemata of what we think is going on. Humans have cultural capacities that genetically evolved, and somehow, black box a bunch of stuff here, we produce these ethnic landscapes. And how we respond to them adaptively could be through a variety of mechanisms. We might just respond to them with some ancestral plastic responses that other species might have as well. So for example, elephants differentiate between Maasai and Kikuyu people on the basis of the ethnic markers that they use, because the Maasai are threats to them and the Kikuyu are not. And it's not that elephants have ethnic groups in their societies. It could be that there are certain genetic adaptations that we all share as humans to be able to deal with this new environment that's culturally constructed. And it could be that we have cultural adaptations that kind of bolster our ability to think about these new worlds. And of course, a combination of all of these. Okay, so I'm going to be asking this question of whether ethnic landscapes, the difference between these two is often really hard to tell, so I'll try to be cautious in my claims about those two. Okay, so my enterprise here is going to be to look at the possibility that specifically ethnic landscapes kind of gave rise to ethnic reasoning adaptations. And not just that these are monolithic kind of units in the mind, but that we should think more carefully about what features of ethnic landscapes that are culturally constructed give rise to or might select for certain ways of thinking about ethnic groups. So for example, if you have cultural institutions of punishment at certain group boundaries, then you might think that that's the boundary at which there'd be cognitive expectations that you should be altruistic to other individuals, or else you'd be punished. But that, I'm sorry if I'm flashing this laser in people's eyes. Okay, but that could be a quite different boundary than the one at which there are norms that are clustered, right? And if you have norm clusters, you're really not a good tool user. I'm so sorry. So the boundary at which you have norm clusters might motivate stereotyping or making predictions about others because there's all this information at that boundary, but it need not be the same boundary at which punishment is happening, for example, or in-group altruism is happening. And finally, something like endogamy norms or obligations to marry within a certain group boundary, again, might not be the same level at which norms are clustered or the same level at which punishment is enforced, but it might give rise to beliefs that identities are stable through the life course, or perhaps even intergenerationally, because people are giving birth to babies that are the same ethnic, that belong to the same ethnic group as their parents, both their parents. And I'm going to entertain the hypothesis that this has been, that a lot of these features, oh my goodness, I'm so incompetent, that a lot of these features have been clustered around linguistic boundaries for much of human evolutionary history, but that cultural evolution can disentangle them. And so if this is the case, then you might expect that humans might privilege linguistic cues for all of these kinds of behavioral outcomes. Okay, and so the question arises then, why privilege linguistic boundaries? And there are several possible reasons. So this is a map of Papua New Guinea, which is one of the most linguistically diverse places on the earth today. And this is actually the little blobs, which I'm sure a linguist would tell me are not really great representations of reality, are even worse than that because these are language families, not even languages, okay? So it's much more rich in diversity than even depicted. So there are reasons to believe that language boundaries have been important features of human social systems for a long part of our evolutionary history. So they're pervasive. The kinds of norms that structure reciprocity or altruism often fall along linguistic boundaries, but they're also developmental reasons. So humans use language daily, so it's information that's available to them readily, and they even start getting access to this information in utero. So there's some evidence that neonates can differentiate the language that their mother spoke from a different language if they differ in terms of cadence, for example. And most of the research that we conduct on social categories and how we think about social categories are in linguistically impoverished regions of the world. So this is a map where countries are now, their area is proportional to the linguistic diversity in the country. And you see that the US and Europe, where most of this research is done, are relatively linguistically impoverished, and that there's a lot more linguistic diversity around the equator. There are lots of reasons why that might be the case. It might be ecological phenomena. It could also be that there have been imperial expansions that have been, and state formation much more important at like higher latitudes. But in any case, we might be quite biased in the way that we think about language boundaries, given the types of societies where we're doing this kind of research. And so this motivated me to go find another context in which to study some of these questions, a really strong test case of some of these hypotheses, specifically the Peruvian altiplano down in South Peru. Okay, and there I'm going to address two main questions. One, are ethnic phenomena products of a single or distinct evolutionary processes? Again, I'm being cagey here about genetic and cultural evolution, but. And then second, do humans privilege linguistic boundaries when learning about others, when interacting with others, for several phenomena? And I'm going to preview the results so that I don't lose people along the way. So structuring them based on these three outcomes, these three possible cognitive adaptations or ethnic reasoning adaptations, in-group altruism, stereotyping, and beliefs about identity stability. And what we find in this Peruvian context is that each of these different outcomes maps most strongly onto different kinds of boundaries. So in-group altruism is mostly organized along community boundaries. Stereotyping is mostly associated with differences in market integration. And stability beliefs, really the adults don't have any boundary that they think is particularly stable intergenerationally or biologically imperative. And that pattern looks quite different when we look at children. So for children, with the exception of this one, which is kind of weak result, it looks like they privilege language for all of these phenomena over some of these other categories. Okay, so I'll introduce my field site briefly and then talk about each of these outcomes. Okay, so why is this a strong test case? This context is a strong test case for hypotheses about the importance of linguistic boundaries. This is happening in southern Peru over here, Quechua and Aymara. I work in the Quechua-Aymara language boundary, and these are two of the largest still spoken indigenous languages. You can see Quechua spoken here, all the way into Ecuador, or Quechua, close relative, and Aymara mostly here on the Bolivian border. So I plot myself down on the Quechua side, and what the Quechua side of the Quechua-Aymara boundary. And specifically in this town, which again is on the Quechua-speaking side of the boundary. But the closest towns to it, or the closest rural villages to this town, are actually Aymara speaking. Okay. And the high school in town is almost evenly split between people who are native Quechua speakers and native Aymara speakers. I should have said, so these are mutually unintelligible languages. Historical linguists argue about how closely related they are because there's been so much work. The consensus right now is that there's been a lot of borrowing because they've been in contact with each other over such long periods of history, but that they actually have deep phylogenetically different roots. And current day Quechua and Aymara speakers cannot understand each other, but they do mostly speak Spanish as well, especially if they're under age 50, so it's not a particular impediment to interaction. Also, a lot of people over age 50 are either trilingual or bilingual Quechua-Aymara speakers because there was so much interaction in this context. And most people here engage in some level of agropastoralism, mostly sheep, but camelids are cuter. And then there's this cross-cutting divide in terms of how market integrated they are. There's some individuals who have shops in town or who engage in trade with people further along the coast or urban centers or in the Amazon or eastern slopes of the Andes. And then there's also some mining that's popped up over the last decade and a half or so that introduced a new source of cash to this economy. So this has produced some really important differences between members of the community that make the linguistic boundary pale in comparison. So some other features of this language boundary that are particularly important and provide a strong test case is that they don't differentiate each other on the basis of morphological cues. And I'll show you some pictures of that, of why that might be the case later. But even if sometimes people make racialized arguments about people who would be almost indistinguishable, and they don't do that locally, even though some of the urban dwellers do. They don't conceive of themselves as one being an immigrant community or group and another one being a host group. As far as they think about these things, like they've been there for time immemorial. And there isn't a huge power difference between Quechua and Aymara speakers. They're both on the more kind of disenfranchised side of this larger divide that is between mestizo or more urban dwellers and more indigenous communities. And if you think about power differences in terms of numerical differences, it is true that globally there are more Quechua speakers, and also in Peru there are more Quechua speakers than Aymara speakers. But if you zoom in to the more local context, it can flip depending on what level you're thinking about. So at the provincial level, there are more Aymara speakers than Quechua speakers. And as you saw, like at the high school, it's pretty much evenly split. So the numerical difference is not that salient, perhaps. So these are some more pictures to show you what this language divide looks like. They're not particularly ethnically marked either. So these are women who live in the same town. Aymara speakers on the left and Quechua speakers on the right. There's some beliefs, some consensus beliefs that Aymara women wear slightly brighter clothing than Quechua women. I haven't actually tested that. It's all within the really bright range of American aesthetic sensibilities, but there could be a signal there. But they don't have any beliefs about that being different between Quechua and Aymara speaking men. And this brings me back to this picture that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, where Quechua and Aymara speakers here are celebrating the same exact religious festival in the same day, in the same ways, the same location. They nominally Catholic. They have the same shared religious and broadly the same shared cultural traditions as well. And there's relatively little animosity as depicted by this kind of convivial interaction. And this couple years ago, near my site on another border, this face of Jesus Christ appeared. I didn't show you the best picture of this, but this is Jesus over here with his mustache and his mouth. So there's like a new religious ritual site that has appeared here that is bringing, again, people who are coming from both the Aymara and Quechua speaking sides of the boundary to celebrate this, again, using the same syncretically Andean and Catholic traditions to do so. There's also a frog, a toad on the side that's magical, and a lot. This is a really special place. You guys should visit it. Okay, and in contrast to that kind of similarity between speakers of these two different languages, the market integration differences that have been exaggerated over the last couple decades have really produced some important differences. So this is just an example. This is the first 3-story noble material or brick house in town that was built by a mining family that got lucky. And it's in contrast to some of like the more common adobe houses that most of the agri-pastoralists make. And it caused quite a bit of resentment and discussion about what were appropriate ways of living and constructing them as well. There are dietary differences, there are stylistic clothing differences that are associated with market integration. And that market integration difference cuts the language boundary. So there are Quechua speakers and Aymara speakers that are agri-pastoralists and Quechua and Aymara speakers that are more market integrated. Okay, so in a context like this, can we uncover any evidence that there really is some level of in-group favoring or in-group altruistic bias towards speakers of the same language? So do linguistic boundaries motivate in-group altruism? I'm going to show you evidence from ethnographic interviews, economic games, and even trying to look at implicit biases that suggest they're not very strong if they're there at all. Okay. So this is my favorite kind of anecdote about the context that I think illustrates that there isn't much hostility and there hasn't been for several decades. Can't do linear spatial mapping. Okay, so historically, Watasani, this is the province and also the name of the town, is predominantly Quechua speaking and historically was part of this Quechua speaking province, majority Quechua speaking province. And in the 1970s, they decided to join this majority Aymara speaking province over here, making themselves effectively a linguistic minority at the provincial level. Okay. And I've asked people, I've done interviews asking them, like, how do you feel about this? Like, why did this go down the way that it did? Well, they really resented the Quechua speakers in Medina, and if they regret it, nobody regretted it. They all thought that this was a sensible political choice to make. So they were willing to make themselves a linguistic minority at the provincial scale, where there are actually funds to be allocated across districts, for example. Okay, but it's possible that language matters when, this was all cheap talk, and that language matters when there are real stakes on the line. So I ran an economic game, as everyone tends to do at some point in their life, and then regrets it. I thought some people would feel that way, maybe not everyone. Where my participants are from Watasani here, which is Quechua speaking, and they had to make allocation decisions between a regional in-group member, so somebody else from Watasani, and a regional out-group member, but the regional out-group members were from different sides of the linguistic boundary, right? So they either had to allocate between a regional and linguistic in-group member and a regional out-group member who was Aymara speaking, or a regional out-group member that was Quechua speaking. Okay, so it was a simple dictator game where half of the participants were told to allocate 5 soles, about a third of a day's wage, between an in-group village person from Watasani and an out-group village person from Taraco. So I didn't say the language name, but everybody knew that Taraco was Quechua speaking. And another condition where they had to allocate between members of Watasani and members of this Aymara speaking out-group. And what we found is that they did exhibit in-group altruism towards members or residents of the same village, okay? So if they had been completely fair, whatever, equitable, they would have donated 50% of the coins to, well, I guess we didn't let them do that because we chose 5, haha. But anyway, at the population level, like they would have donated half to the in-group village. And in fact, they tended to favor the in-group village members. But it didn't matter whether the comparison was with an out-group village member that was from a Quechua village or an Aymara-speaking village. Okay? So they give similarly to Quechua and Aymara-speaking out-groups. And this, we were concerned, well, there are multiple reasons we ran this other version where we were concerned that there was reputational considerations and they didn't want to seem stingy or biased to the experimenters. So we introduced a random element here where we couldn't actually trace who was doing what. And at the population level, if anything, this reduced the bias. And again, the Quechua and Aymara out-group village allocations were indistinguishable from each other. Okay, but it's possible that, again, they don't behave in a particularly biased way, but that they have certain implicit biases that they're not willing to put on display in a way that might be detectable. And so we did another regrettable thing, which is use an implicit association task. I just do all the regrettable things that other disciplines do. Hopefully there's some information value here, right? And here the tactic is to rely on categorization speed. So even if people don't want to tell you that they're racist or people don't want to tell you that they're ethnicist, they might still have certain associations in their mind between out-group members being bad and in-group members being good that will affect their reaction times when they're forced to categorize different stimuli. So in this case, because it's a not very literate population and we wanted to do this task with children as well, we modified it so that the visual stimuli of good and bad were spiders and flowers, and I actually ran another task where we confirmed that spiders are perceived as bad and flowers as good. It might be a human universal, possibly. We're not allowed to say that in anthropology departments. Okay, and then they would hear language spoken in, so the greetings are very basic words in Aymara or in Quechua. Okay, so it was visual information and linguistic information. And some of the times, the negative stimuli was associated consistently with the same button on the left-hand side, let's say, with the out-group language, button. And the positive stimuli was associated with the Quechua language in-group stimuli. And so because these are potentially consistent with a negative out-group stereotype, we would have expected them to categorize these more quickly and make fewer errors. But here I'm just doing speed. So these would have been fast categorizations. And then when we flip things around and now the in-group is associated with the nasty spiders, they would have slowed down in their categorization. That's the point. Okay. And what we found was that well, first of all, if anything, there's a weak decline, and so the stronger the effect size D here is, the more of a bias there is, the faster they are with a consistently out-group negative ones relative to the in-group negative ones. So this is more kind of in-group favoring bias. And we see that if anything, it decreases with age. That's pretty consistent. And when we come, the reason that I'm using these weird age categories and this weird effect size D is because it's what social psychologists have done elsewhere. And so if we compared these effect sizes to a similar task with American participants who were white and were forced to categorize African American and European American stimuli, it's almost twice the size. And the effect sizes are pretty similar to the American sample sizes when they did it, when social psychologists did it with Japanese Korean values as well. Okay, so if anything, they're fairly weak biases if we can compare these effect sizes. Okay, so the linguistic in-group preferences are weak. Most of the data is from adults, and if anything, it decreases with age rather than increases with age, though that is a tenuous claim. Okay, so it's still possible that even if they don't really hate Aymara speakers, they might still have certain stereotypes about them if it was information-rich category, or if they expected it to be. Some of the ethnographic information should make you doubtful that adults would think that way. Okay, but so do linguistic boundaries motivate stereotyping? So this is old stuff that some of you helped me develop here. Sorry about that. In order to do this, we use a fairly simple task again to be able to use it with children and with adults, where we presented them with 3 characters, 2 of whom were the same because they spoke the same language, and the other 2 were the same because they did the same occupational kind of thing, like fixing cars, as opposed to farming. And then he told them that this character, who shared one trait with each, had this novel feature. In this case, they liked eating bago, some novel food item. And we chose like 8 different traits. It wasn't just food. And we asked them to predict which of the other 2 would have the same feature. So would they make a generalization based on language or based on having a similar occupational strategy? And across 3 different studies, we varied the novelty of the categories involved. So I just showed you the study where we use real-world categories, Quechua and Aymara speaking, fixing cars, doing agropastoralism. In another study, we used fictional categories. So we just made up new terms like sorega and nesia as the language categories. It was a bit weird with occupational categories, but we said they worked doing blah blah, or they subsisted off of blah blah. But in the analogous study, we said that people who spoke these 2 languages lived about 3 hours walking distance from each other in different communities. So somehow geographically parallel or analogous to the context in Peru. And then in the fictional category, we moved it even further from the local context by not providing that analogizing scenario or information. And what we found across the H categories was that with increasing novelty of the category, so from real world to fictional, we saw that participants increase their probability of using language to make predictions about others, as opposed to relying on the occupational information. In fact, in the real world scenario, people were more likely to use the occupational information than they were to use the linguistic information slightly to predict novel traits about others. And in the fictional condition, it was the reverse. And then in a 4th study, we had some developmental trajectories here that are consistent with what I'm about to show you, but we worried that it's possible that the children didn't really know what the labels were yet, and that if we presented the information as audio information where they actually heard Quechua speaking with which they would have been familiar, or Aymara speaking with which they wouldn't have been familiar, that it might have triggered some different kinds of reasoning. So we did the same kind of task, but now the characters spoke to the participants. And here's where we found the strongest developmental trajectory, where children under age 8, or if you like continuous functions, you can look at the line, are predicted to have made more language-based predictions than occupation-based predictions, whereas the adults had the reverse pattern. So the adults look similar over here in the audio condition, or in the audio study, and in the labeling study when they're about real-world categories, whereas the children, in the label studies, it looks similar but not as strong, rely more on the language information to make predictions about others. Okay, so it looks like language-based stereotyping is present in the adults in this community, but only in novel scenarios when they haven't yet learned that the language boundary is not locally relevant. So it's as if they keep this expectation that language might be relevant for predicting things about others in other contexts, even though it's not locally. And children, on the other hand, even in this context, use the language to make predictions about others, even in the context and in the conditions where the adults did not. And this is despite, so you might think that this is a cohort effect, where language is more important to the younger generations, but if anything, this Quechua-Aymara language boundary and divide is decreasingly important as people become more Spanish-speaking. The third possibility is that children and adults are living in slightly different worlds, so children have yet to have much experience with Aymara speakers, and that might be part of the reason why you get these differentiated patterns. Okay, so even if people don't have rich stereotypes about speakers of different languages, they might still think that there's something inherent about being an Aymara speaker that you can't change and that is somehow transmitted biologically. What does it mean to be an Aymara speaker? And so we used, in order to ask this question of whether linguistic identities are perceived as being inherited from parents, we used the switched at birth method that I know some of you have used here as well. Regrettable decisions, but sometimes it's hard to be creative methodologically. Okay, so ask yourself, what would you think if I tell you the story about parents who have a young baby, they're from one group, and then they tragically die in an accident, leaving an orphan baby on the road, and then luckily some adoptive parents from another group rescue the baby and raise it as their own in ignorance of their past identity, of their birth parents. And if I were to ask you, when this baby grows up, will he be Quechua like his birth parents or Aymara like his adoptive parents, what would you say? Okay. And we asked the same question, we used the same scenario for residential identities as well. So these are geographic identities, being limeño, where this is being from Lima. It's like a really big, market-integrated cosmopolitan city. It's the capital, versus Watasaneño, this rural, small town. Okay. This does conflate market integration differences and regional differences, but I think we could talk about which one I think is driving the effect later on. Okay, and so first I'm showing you what the probability of saying this baby is going to be the same identity as the birth parent. What is the probability of choosing that option as a function of age? Okay. And what we see is something kind of similar to the stereotyping or inductive inference effects, where children think that Marco is going to be Quechua like his birth parents, even though he doesn't know who his birth parents are. Okay? And adults think that's ridiculous. You might as well. In fact, this result has been found with American children too, thinking about, I think it was Portuguese versus English speaking. And interestingly, the same wasn't true for the regional information. Okay, so the children did not think that if you were born in Watasani, you were a Watasaneño for life. Or if you had Watasaneño parents, you're a Watasaneño for life. The adults look like they're essentializing here, but I've run some other studies where what's going on is that the birthplace really matters. So if you're born in Watasani, about 60% of adults think that you're Watasaneño for life, but whatever your parents' identity was or where they were from didn't really matter. It drops down close to zero if you account for the birthplace. Okay, so these beliefs that linguistic identity are inherited and stable are only found in the children of Watasani and are not found for regional identities, or this developmental trajectory is not found for regional identities, suggesting that there might be something special about language. And adults don't feel this way about any identity that I've tested so far. And so, follow-up question, is this cross-culturally true? This is actually one of the few opportunities that I've had to be able to systematically check this, because people have used this unfortunate method in a lot of different places. Like, it's not my fault, okay? So at least we can do cross-cultural systematic investigations. Brooke had something to do with this too. Alejandro had something to do with this. Like, we're all complicit in this. So I'm sure we're all open to new suggestions of how to get at this better. For now, we have the switched at birth task. So I'm going to get back to that soon. And just to recap for now, what we see in the Watasani context is that in-group altruism is really structured at the community level in this area, whereas language, there's some evidence that children might have slight bias towards kind of speakers of the same language. Honestly, my data is not the strongest data for that, but there are other social psychologists and developmental psychologists that have uncovered interesting patterns, like Katie Kinsler showing that infants prefer to grab toys from speakers of the same language. I'm forgetting, it's been so long. Language or dialect speakers, I think dialect. And that 5-year-olds even prefer speakers of the same language over same race individuals for friendships in a context like South Africa, which is obviously notoriously segregated. So I think that the literature has stronger evidence that this might be the case than like what I've presented to you. I've shown you some evidence that the adults don't really use language to form stereotypes about others in the local context, although they might hold on to an expectation that language is predictive of things in the world generally. And that market integration structures a lot of important phenomena that leads them to, in that same task, privilege, occupation, or subsistence-based behaviors for making predictions about others. And that children do have this expectation that language categories might be things that are inherited in a biological-like fashion and stable through life in a way that adults in the community do not. And they do not think that way about any category. And so, I mean, it's still unclear what's going on here, why we have this early developing bias, but it's possible that it is because we, like, the way that I framed this was that, ethno-linguistic groups and language boundaries or linguistic boundaries have been important parts of human evolutionary history, such that it might behoove one to look in that direction for information of who's an in-group or an out-group member. Okay, so it's possible that there's such types of adaptations for thinking about or genetic adaptations or predispositions for thinking about ethno-linguistic groups. But I'm very willing to entertain the possibility that something more general about the fact that children are are really specialized at becoming competent language learners, and so that at this phase in life, they're actually not engaging in very many intergroup interactions, but they have to become really competent language learners. And so there might be certain kinds of attentional biases that make them pay attention to how people speak that are not group specific, but that somehow get integrated into the way that they're learning about who are people that I should make inductive inferences about, who I should interact with, and so forth. So the selective pressure being group specific is still a bit unclear to me, and I'm not 100% sure how we would untangle that. Okay, so I think the study information suggests that there are distinct selection pressures. They might well be cultural evolutionary pressures for forming boundaries of different sorts that would motivate in-group preferences, that would motivate stereotyping, or that people would respond to with beliefs about identities being fixed depending on the institutional structures on the ground. But that there still might be early developing cognitive mechanisms that privilege language boundaries for all of these phenomena. Okay. And then there's this open question of what these mechanisms evolved for. Okay, so getting back to this question of like how cross-culturally true is this essentialist pattern about language, for example, regarding beliefs that linguistic identity are inherited and stable. And going back to the first video motivating some of these questions, do they apply to other kinds of boundaries? Do these essentialist biases apply to other kinds of boundaries? Maybe not the regional ones that we picked up on, but maybe other kinds of social boundaries also motivate essentialist reasoning or beliefs that identities are stable. And one claim that's out there in the literature that like Rita Astuti has found some evidence in Madagascar that children might have biases for treating morphologically different people as if that is a more important feature of their identity or stable, even in a context where adults do not. And part of the reason why you thought that girl was so funny was because you have the same intuition as well, right? So is this actually a feature of human psychology that morphologically defined groups are somehow going to be seen as more essential? Okay, so in order to do this project, I just collected data from, or collated all of the data from people who use this task and limited, well, not quite because I think Alejandro's not on this, but he will be. And limited to switched up birth task where the migration is happening at birth, basically, where there's no possibility of a social influence. And so these are, each of the dots represents a different effect size, but each, they could be from the same study. So for example, here's a sample of participants from Montreal who were bilingual versus participants from Montreal who were monolingual and who were opining about the French-English, either French and English versus a foreign language boundary. Okay. Here there are several from Fiji, where there are different populations, but also the same population opining about different boundaries. Okay, so it's a hierarchically structured data set here. And what I'm showing you here is just raw data in terms of the age of the participants. So the mean age of the participants, it's being pooled here, and the percentage of them that are choosing that the child is going to have the same identity as the birth parent. So you could think of this as like proportion of, or percent of people who are, actually it's not proportion, sorry, that are essentialists. So you see that among adults, I'm just cutting it off as 20 for all the adults because I'm not interested in kind of differences between 30-year-olds and 80-year-olds. Among adults, there's quite a lot of variation. Basically, the whole spectrum is represented here in terms of essentialist beliefs. And if anything, they're kind of on the low end, contrary to some perspectives that humans are just naturally essentialists about social groups of any kind. And when we expand this, so some of these have developmental data and some of these don't, but when we add that, it looks like, and I'll show you evidence that it is, that if anything, children are a little bit higher in terms of their mean levels of essentialism than adults are, but that more importantly, like they seem to diversify into adulthood. So there are some societies where essentialism goes up as an individual's age, and some societies or some boundaries about which essentialism goes down when people age. Okay. There's a lot of incomplete data here, but we put this all into a model that's multi-level so that it accounts for the fact that there's the same populations in producing data for multiple outcomes, for example. And we coded each of the different effects as being about different kinds of boundaries. So for example, boundaries that represented language differences between the two groups, or boundaries that, these are not mutually exclusive, boundaries where there is a morphological difference between the two groups, or boundaries where there is a status difference between the two groups, right? And there's a lot of correlation between those. So these are the different ways that we coded the boundaries. So the Q differentiating the boundary could include a stylistic difference, a status difference, a religion difference, a difference in language, and a difference in morphology. And on the horizontal axis is the effect that having this Q had on the probability of an essentialist claim. Sorry, I keep just observing your line of vision. Jan's a lot calmer though, like he doesn't complain. Okay, so the higher the dot is, obviously you see these 95% confidence intervals are quite wide, but the higher the dot is, the more this Q triggers essentialism, or corresponds to an essentialist response. Okay, so the highest essentialist responses actually were for boundaries that were marked by stylistic differences and status differences. These are all independent of each other, not controlling for the others. Okay? And in fact, language is kind of on the low end, and morphological differences were the weakest of all of these. Okay? And I could get to like maybe some intuitions for why that might be the case. Okay. And not only that, but the use of the cues developed differently. So here it's now the interaction effect. So how much more do individuals use that cue as they age for making essentialist predictions? So here on the right-hand side, we have cues that increase in the extent to which people use them as people age. Okay? So adults are using stylistic differences and status differences between groups as stronger indicators that those groups are kind of biologically different, or that that identity is inherited in a biological-like fashion than kids are, and more so than that developmental trajectory applies to like any of the other cues. So status and style differences kind of acquire their essentialist properties, if that makes sense, through the course of development. Okay, this is, regret it, I'm so sorry. Okay, this is just to show you that like I did, so you saw how many data points I have, so there are not that many boundaries. So I can't put all of the cues, there's collinearity problems, so I can't put all of the cues into the same model. But I did compare a bunch of models where there were controlling for, let's see. So I compared the models one by one, where you had for example, the morphological cue and then the morphological cue by age. And the best models here are ones that include the interaction of status and age and style and age, and not the main effects for them. Okay, and so this is what what the effects look like. So again, here we have age. Each of these now represents an individual when we had individual level data, which we did for some of these studies. Actually, for a lot of them, we were able to analyze it as individual level data because it's just a proportion. So if you have 100 participants and 60% of them chose one, then you kind of can reconstruct the individual level data from that, but you might not have their individual level age. So for those, we just kind of repeated the age. So the age for each choice, and again, we clustered all the adults, we just capped them at 20. And the proportion of them choosing the fixed identity, so the essentialist claim. This is what the data look like, and this is what the models look like. So the purple one is boundaries that were marked by style differences, and the pink ones were ones that were not marked by stylistic differences. And you see that the children actually don't really differentiate between boundaries that are stylistically marked versus not stylistically marked for making their essentialist identities or essentialist claims, but they're generally more essentialist than the adults are. And this differentiation of caring about the stylistic marker, or it being correlated, stylistic markers being correlated with essentialist claims, appears in adulthood. And this looks pretty similar for status differences as well. So again, the children are not really using status differences between the cues. They might not be even aware of them for making essentialist claims, but the adults are. And just to show you language differences, so this is like a word of caution, don't believe what I just said from Matasani, or there are confounds, and maybe you should believe what I said from Matasani because it's from a single population and it's well controlled. I don't know, you be the judge. I feel conflicted about this, but there doesn't seem to be much of a developmental difference in how much language is used to make essentialist claims. Okay, so the two lines here are pretty parallel to each other, meaning that the difference between linguistically marked, or really they were all, most of them had some linguistic difference between the groups, but so I coded them as a language difference versus a kind of dialectical difference here. And really the effect of that kind of stays constant through age. And interestingly, religious differences look similar, and morphological differences are look similar again. Like it's possible that there's a bit more use of the morphological information as informing essentialist options in young participants than in old participants, but it's not a significant effect. And if you remember, all of the morphology models were at the bottom of the model comparison table. Okay, so these beliefs that ethnic group identities are stable are generally higher in children and do decrease with age across all of the different groups that we've seen. And they develop differently for different, from species reasoning. Oh, I didn't show you that data. So people have also done switched at birth tasks with species where they're like, if a chicken is raised by, or they don't say that, but they say like if this organism that is given birth to by something that looks like a chicken is raised by something that looks like a a duck, will it be a chicken or a duck? I think there was a cow versus, there are a couple of species comparisons. They're usually within order or within class at least. And not surprisingly, most adults say, there's some cross-cultural variation, but most adults say that a chicken gives rise to a chicken. And children feel that way as well, but not as strongly as the adults do. So the developmental trajectories for species reasoning and ethno-linguistic group reasoning look quite different. They become more homogeneous as people age for species reasoning, and they diversify for ethno-linguistic reasoning. And specifically for ethno-linguistic reasoning, these beliefs diversify with age across different sites, but critically depend on the cues that characterize the group. So it looks like so far that status differences between groups and stylistic differences between groups are ones that tend to be perceived or culturally evolved to have kind of essentialist properties and local ideology local ideologies. So I just want to thank all of you guys for listening and people who helped collect this data, people who helped give me this data. Adaptation, really important. Sorry. Who funded some of this research.
Hi, thank you very much. Just a clarifying question, how did you, or how were stylistic differences defined in that study?
Let me think of some examples. So for example, in the case of Watasani, like there wouldn't have been one for Quechua and Aymara, but there would have been one between the regional differences because there's traditional clothing and kind of market bought clothing. Well, they're all market bought, but like more kind of modern clothing would have been counted as a stylistic differences. So they were almost all clothing differences. There are a couple.
Teeth knocked out in the himba.
Yeah, the teeth knocked out in the himba versus Haro. There wouldn't have been for like the language of the Montreal people. Indo-Fijian versus native Fijian, I think were coded as such. So more often than not, it was clothing, but I think the himba Herero is one of the few that is not
The
that.
house, I think we did, I don't know whether that counted style, or like what kind of house they lived in.
So we happen to use visual information, visual cues that included house, but I coded these on the basis of kind of properties that individuals would carry with them because most of the time, like stimuli were not provided in the articles. So I tried to make the assessments on the basis of ethnographic research on the individuals.
And did it also include behavioral practices?
No. I mean, yeah. So it'd be cool to get something like a measure of cultural dissimilarity between them along like a list of norms. I don't know exactly how we would do that, but it's true that also like gait might be informative from a distance even, and like be the equivalent of a stylistic difference, but I just don't know how we'd go about doing that. Yeah.
Thanks, this is really interesting. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about either your specific methods or the broader project of assessing linguistic judgments in populations with multilinguistic populations, right? Because I think, we know from developmental literature that children who are being raised bilingual have different beliefs about other people's possibility of bilingualism than monolingual children do, right? So what does it mean for a child who's being raised in a multilingual environment to identify someone as an X speaker, and does that rule out the possibility of them being a Y speaker as well?
And those are all really good questions. So there's variation that I don't have individual level data on that would be really cool to look at. Some households where they really want their children just to speak Spanish at this point. And so it is a multilingual environment insofar as like grandmother might still speak Quechua, but there's a range of exposure, for example, to multiple languages. And it has some methodological, and there's also like mixed language families as well, where the mother's Quechua versus and the father's Aymara speaking, let's say. But I don't have that individual level data. But it does inform interpretation of some of the results when you think about what children were listening to as a stimuli. For example, where they would have heard a language I understand, let's say Quechua, and then some Spanish as well for some of the studies. And then a language I don't understand, right? So it's not that they necessarily have like Aymara specific predictions at that point. It could just be like gibberish. That is like a critique of what the inference you can draw about kind of language specific stereotypes or beliefs, as opposed to just things that I understand versus things that I don't understand. In terms of mutual exclusivity, it's kind of interesting because mutual exclusivity could actually be different from kind of the biological inheritance belief. You could have like a partible paternity kind of version of a belief for languages where you do inherit Quechua and Aymara essences or something from your parents, and you can be both, or you can't be both. You inherit it from your mother only, something like that. And we have a little bit of data on that only with adults, where they have this linguistic convention of actually not calling people Quechua or Aymara, they call them Quechuista or Aymarista. So it has this ista ending, which is basically functionally equivalent to ist, like dentist, anarchist in English. And something that you can become. It's usually used for things that you can become. And so I had the thought that that implied that it was generally, even among adults, like a more fluid, or even among adults, like a more fluid belief about being able to become Quechua or being able to become Aymara. They tell me that I can become Quechua if my language competence improves a bit more. And so I did the switched up birth task with two different conditions where I used the Quechuista and Aymarista ending versus the Quechua and Aymara ending. And it actually switched the mutual exclusivity claims, but not the biological inheritance claims. So they were more likely to say that when I use the ista ending, that you could be Quechuista and Aymarista, than they were to say that you could be Quechua and Aymara. So for what it's worth, it's possible that being able so living in a multilingual environment might help you think that things are not mutually exclusive, but it might not inform the inheritance belief. I'm not sure. It's a good point, and I should take advantage of more of the variation that actually exists in the site to investigate questions like that.
Hi, first off, thank you, super interesting. I was thinking a little bit about the stereotyping work. That was the one with the pictures and the, so I was wondering to what extent, and whether or not you have intuitions about this, to what extent the, change across development in probability of making one or the other attribution is a genuine maturational constraint or a constraint of exposure.
Exposure, I know, yeah.
Like, have you looked at sort of whether, like you could imagine that in a situation that's less market integrated, children are doing more work and thus are more able to do reasoning about work, and so there might be an asymmetry in, a market integrated versus less market integrated sort of circumstance. Do you have any data on that?
I was thinking, I hadn't thought about the extent to which they're engaging in the market economy as they develop, clearly that expands, but I agree. So that they might start thinking about occupational differences as more meaningful as they expand. The same is true for language differences, and I was more worried about that. So one possible explanation for this would go something like, they do have some limited information about market integration differences from their teachers, for example. That would be their main source of that information, not so much that they're working more, just that they have teachers that are coming from out of town and they contrast with their parents and they have access to that information early on. They don't have that much access to information about what Aymara speakers are. There's a preschool in town where there are a couple of Aymara speaking kids that come in, but it's like all of their interactions are in Spanish, right? And so they might not even know if they're from Aymara speaking families. And then they get to high school, and all of a sudden they're put into this environment that's 50% Aymara, 50% Spanish speaking, right? And so something that I have to do, that I keep saying I have to do that I haven't done, is look to see if there's like a discontinuity there in high school. I think like empirically, given the data I have right now, that would be the coolest way or the best way to test it, to see if like all of a sudden their patterns shift when they become like 14 years old and they get entered into this environment. I could have seen that going either way, right? Like I could see that, the lack of exposure could have made them think it's less different. Like it's unclear where the prior would go without information about the world. And especially given that like the teacher versus their parents difference is one that they do have access to that information and is so different, that if anything, that should have increased the extent to which they privilege like the occupational difference as important, and they do the opposite. So it gives me a little bit of hope that maybe that effect is not just because of environmental differences, but at the end of the day, they become fully competent, knowledgeable members of their adult communities, and presumably that's because they start getting more and more information and interaction with more individuals from both linguistic communities. But yeah, plan of action, do you want to do it? Do you want to just do my regression discontinuity on the high school people? I keep saying I'm doing this, but I haven't, so that's something that I think would help that inference. I think Clark was there, and then Brooke.
So, hypothetical question. You started with a working definition of ethnicity, which then you kind of imposed on. You used to design the experiments, right? So, hypothetical question. What if there is something like a conceptual primitive of ethnicity that people have, but you haven't identified it here?
Right.
So that these groups that you're putting on this graph are mixing together.
These. Yes.
Ones that people think of as ethnic. Yes. Again, we don't know what that is, and ones that they don't.
I agree. This
and
is
then your
so
analysis
arbitrary.
comparing them all
Yes.
is muddying the waters
Muddying the
because
waters, yes.
you're not actually, you're mixing ethnic groups with other kinds of groups in people's psychology.
And in a way, like, I agree that this is a muddy water right here, and I guess I try to de-muddy it by starting to pull out the cues to try to figure out, like, if there were a conceptual primitive, what would it look like, or what would these cues, how would these cues, like, map onto it, right? Like the stylistic one, the religion one. I think it's hard to imagine, like, how religion would be a conceptual primitive, but certain kind of visual features that might be relevant, right? Like morphological differences that would be available to people. Something that I already did to de-muddy the water, but maybe it's worse. Like, I got rid of the ones that were switched at birth with, like, there were sex switched at birth ones, that was really weird. Gender switched at birth ones, that was really weird. And I got rid of some that were personality switched at birth. And then I started getting, like, this existential crisis because I'm like, actually, I've run this study also with a bunch of other traits that are like the father has a large liver, or the biological father has a large liver, and the adoptive parents have, like, a small liver. Why is, like, liver size not part of this whole suite of traits, right? And I didn't do that because expediency slash, like,
right, those tasks have different
they have different
validities.
Yeah, but
potentially.
But conceptually, like, it's unclear why, like, maybe whatever conceptual primitive exists doesn't include personality or beliefs or behaviors, right? And these are just, like, labels that like we as adults now with our concept of ethnicity kind of recognize, like, know it when we see it, right? So I completely agree, and I guess so far my attempt at de-muddying is, like, the next step, the regressions, where I try to pull out the cues. But if you have any other suggestions, I'm open to maybe even incorporating that other literature and doing, like, a broader analysis. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about all this variation here, and other than age, what might be predicting, and just what you think about flexibility and
individual level or group level or
group level. Well, I was thinking, like, okay, so you've got some groups here where, like, your Peruvian example, where the two groups get along pretty well. They don't have a big history of real, like, violent interethnic conflict, at least from what I gather from you. And then you've got, like, Jews and Arabs, right? Or you've got, or if you were to run this, just like the Chicana and the Pucat or something like that, right? Where there's just, like, and I'm just wondering, in terms of what you think about how flexible these things are and how sort of responsive they are to these local conditions and how the groups get along.
Well, I mean, the paper I have with you is, like, the first thing that fucked up my intuitions about this. So maybe I'll, like, let the room in on that experience.
Well, maybe we just had a small example.
No, because there was a real effect there. Okay, so as I remember, they're somewhere here. The Namibia sample is Brooke's fault, right? So we interviewed Himba people, and there's this really neat comparison that's like a look. I do think that actually getting at, like, what group level features are functionally important might be better addressed maybe by these more local comparisons, honestly. And so this was an attempt at doing that. There's this cool difference between the relations that Himba have with Herero and Himba have with Damara. Do you want to? I feel like I'm
No, that's okay. You're the lead author on the paper. You designed it.
Okay. So, as I understand it, the Himba and the Herero were culturally like the same population 150 years ago, more or less. And because Germans like intervening in places, a lot of people like intervening in places, there was kind of a split during this kind of imperial and genocidal campaign that they had in Namibia, where some individuals like went into a region and remained pastoralists and became Himba now, and the Herero, I forget exactly if they became more market integrated, but they're still pastoralists.
Yeah, they're still pastoralists, but they are more market integrated, and they have very different stylistic.
Yeah, super ethnically marked. Not so culturally different though. And they have, not so linguistically different either. And they have a very recent cultural ancestry, we can be sure of that. And then there are this other community, the Damara, that are linguistically, culturally really distinct. So just first pass intuitions were that, our intuitions were that they would be more essentialist about the more culturally distinct category, that would be harder to transcend that boundary, right? And this is actually possibly a methodological problem more than a conceptual one, but that was our hypothesis. And then add to the matter that when Brooke did some interviews with people about how they would feel about their daughter marrying a Damara person versus a Herero person, we didn't even do stats on this, like 100% of the participants said that they'd much rather their daughter marry a Herero person than a Damara person. So there's also like hostility between Himba and Damara to add to the cultural differences there. Some of the participants went so far as to offer committing suicide if like their daughter married a Damara person, right? So it's not such an easy relationship there. And yet we found absolutely no difference between, we found a little bit of it, but we found generally like no difference between how essentialist they were on the switched up birth task between Himba and Herero. So if a child was born to Himba individuals, Himba parents, and was adopted by Herero, they would become Herero. And if they were adopted by a Damara person, they were a Damara. Okay? And that we had a couple, that's the only data that I'm showing here, but we had a couple other conditions. So if the migration happened at marriage, for example, and for some of the adult conditions, it looked like, if anything, the opposite pattern, where if the woman married the Damara, if a woman married a Damara person, she was more likely to become Damara than to become Herero. And we speculated a little bit that actually contingent on, maybe that migration is not very possible or very likely given your ethnographic observations, but contingent on making that kind of decision, you're breaking your ties here and you're definitely becoming Damara, right? So that's actually a methodological problem with the switched up birth task, that we're saying not what's real about the world, not what the migrations are like, but contingent on this very implausible thing, what is this identity now?
But so did with the Jews Arabs comparison, did you find any other, because I've always been perplexed by this too, and we sort of spun the story, but I'm curious as to whether you see any replication of that in any of these other studies that you look at.
I think there might be file drawer effects going on here, but some of the really nice comparisons like that do pick up on important differences. I don't remember the Jewish Arab ones right now, but this one's a really classic study between Brahmins and Hariyan. So these are caste differences, and it actually kind of supports the overall cross-cultural claim where the ability to transcend like a caste boundary was directional. So the higher caste individuals were less likely to accept lower caste individuals as being able to come into their group than the reverse. So that's actually more consistent with the way we had been interpreting the task before. And then this Bezo one is actually Rita Studi's work, where she asked the Bezo about Masikoro individuals that have no genetic population difference from the Bezo versus Karani, who are coming from a South Asian migration to Madagascar. And she found kind of similarly to us where they're more culturally, more economically, and more morphologically different. The adults did not make differentiate between those two boundaries in terms of how essentializing they were. They were pretty low on essentialism. She found this other effect where actually the children did differentiate and were more essentialist about the more distant and more kind of morphologically distinct group. I think yeah, I have to go back and review these, right? So like, does it matter that, does it matter whether you're a religious Jew versus a secular Jew, right? Like in terms of how fixed you think the boundary is, and I think the answer is yes. And there's actually some priming effects showing that if you prime people with stability beliefs, they're actually like about the Jewish-Arab boundary in the Middle East, like they're less likely to want to be able to negotiate across that boundary as well. So there are some potentially like behavioral outcomes that might make sense, but yeah, those are all predictions that I would have had. Ours seem to fall farthest away from that, but I do wonder if there are file drawer effects here that are not being reported. And I'm actually working with some undergraduates on kind of a more ATRAP-like project on kind of the ways that people can transition across different kinds of group boundaries, not just what you think of as like ethnic groups, but like corporate kinship group boundaries as well. So you could imagine that if there's a resource that is finite that needs to be defended, or is zero sum, like you wouldn't want to allow people the opportunity of becoming a group member. And I think that's kind of what's going on with the Brahmins and Haryans, except that the resource is like a prestige or status resource as opposed to a material one. Whereas there are situations where like having larger groups is better, for example, in times of warfare, if you can trust them, right? So that's a bit of a confund. But yeah, I'm not convinced that this like defending group boundaries at all costs is like necessarily what will culturally evolve under like the widest range of circumstances, and we should be considering kind of returns to scale of group size as possible reasons why these essentialist beliefs don't hold a lot of the time. Yeah.
So I want to draw attention to the lack of uniqueness of the morphological components in the process, because it seems to me that defeats a hypothesis that I have.
Oh, I remember this
around.
one.
Yeah. Right. So,
Neanderthals.
yeah, that the proper domain is not interethnic; it's interspecific, and that race is a shallow eliciter of species difference rather than a super releaser of ethnic difference. Yeah. And I mean, the fact that the linguistic markers are, if anything, more salient than the morphological ones.
Yeah, but not much either, right? So I mean, I'm also like not going to hang my hat on language on this outcome either, but.
Sure, but that morphology it's not privileged in any special way. And clearly, if the design was for interspecific reasoning, then it would need to be, because that would be your principal. Would be the one thing that you had access to, in addition to being a gross cue, right? So, there goes a good idea, I think.
I wouldn't give up hope. Okay, well, I was skeptical of your idea, and then like all of these ancient DNA studies come out, and actually there's good evidence that there was kind of costs, like real fitness costs and to hybridizing across like human Neanderthal and human Denisovan, right? And who knows before we were Australopithecine. So I do think we have a species psychology. I think this, what it applies to is unclear. And most of these, the reason why I say like maybe don't give up hope on that idea more generally is that I think that, so most of these morphological cues are skin color based, and maybe that's just not the cue, right? Maybe it's not skin tone, and maybe like Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo sapiens were not skin tone defined by skin tone differences, pigmentation differences, and that some more gross morphology difference was actually critical. But it does defeat a little bit the idea that modern day kind of pigmentation variation is what do you call a sub-releaser? A shallow releaser of that psychology. But it could just be that psychology exists for different cues.
That's generous of you.
Well, I also, this is kind of interesting. I'm working with an archaeologist, I told you this a little bit over the weekend, who works with people who has found some of the earliest evidence of cranial modification in the hunter-gathering population, actually. And this is something that actually changes morphology substantially. People look kind of like aliens when they do this. There are different ways of doing this. It could be like long this way versus broad this way. So it'd be kind of interesting if that served as a shallow releaser in a way that pigmentation might not.
I have just a quick question. It might also be suggestion for further research, but has anyone looked at the lowland population of South America and like the very different kinship systems that you encounter there? Like either, like I'm specifically thinking about the Bapes region.
Yeah, I know, so cool.
Where you have an inheritance which is, of course, primarily linguistics,
yeah.
but which is correlated with somehow actually like blood relatedness.
Is it correlated? So
Through the father's line. So it's the Patrick clan is. So essentially, you don't speak a mother language. You speak your father's language, and you're desocialized into you immediately reprimanded for talking like your mother. So how would that affect, like in both of these these experiences, especially sort of the birth, because if it's such a strong link between blood relatedness plus language, there might be some effect here, but yeah.
So they're prescriptively, linguistically exogamous as well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So you think that, well, by adulthood, the easiest predictions are in adulthood, right? By adulthood, their ideological system would seem to suggest that you might inherit a language in a biological-like fashion, but only from your father's side, right?
Yeah.
And not from your mother's side. And it's consistent with like the way that non-linguistic identities like Judaism, right, might be the opposite, right, maternally inherited. Now, what that would do to child's expectations about the world in a society like that, where they actually have really early information that their mother, I assume they would be hearing their mother speak a different language, even if they're not allowed to speak it.
Well, yeah, they do know, they learn it, but only passively.
Passively, right.
Or competent.
Right. I think we're pretty good social learners and statistical learners, so I would assume that the children would be even less essentialist about language in a context like that when they see that somebody that's caring for them and that perhaps fulfills this maternal role isn't like them, or isn't supposed to be like them. But that's just a prediction. Yeah,
You should send someone.
I know. Yeah, so this is one of the rare cases where a lot of where people are supposed to marry outside of a linguistic group, and people carry, it's very multilingual area as well, as my understanding, so I think people are competent in multiple languages, but they carry an identity based on a single one of those lineages, right? In Venezuela and Brazil.
Yeah, exactly, in the border region.
Yeah.
So I recognize your dispositional agnosticism and
I'm an atheist.
and self-determination. I was speaking about science. But so in framing the project to begin with, you said you're happy to entertain two possibilities. One is that there was a biologically evolved psychological adaptation for these distinctions, and the other is one of two possibilities you seem to spell out. One is that there is cultural evolution that favors a particular kind of adult phenotype, and the other is that in the context of culturally evolved institutions, practices, differences, just the developmental environment is such that it results in this, right? The third of those seems the least plausible in the sense that given all of the cultural evolutionary selective pressures for parochial altruism and xenophobia and all the rest of it, that you know, it would be difficult to get a situation in which you didn't have direct cultural selection for an adult phenotype. And my question then is, if you buy that, I don't understand why you don't buy the first one, because...
Wait, remind me of the first one.
The first one
I
is
actually only heard two is the problem, but...
Okay, so
Sorry.
as I understood your presentation, there's the sort of the, you know, the deep biologically evolved innate psychology, call it, right? Then there's the institution as a product of cultural evolution. And a third would be, there is cultural evolution that creates practices and distinctions, but doesn't do anything to ontogeny. And it's just in the developmental environment in which you end up getting those, because kids are exposed to input that produces that. But there's not actually any selection to produce it. I mean, even holding aside the distinction.
The second and the third.
Well, we'll forget about this
Okay.
distinction between the second and the third, because it's not important to the point that I'm making.
Okay.
The point that I'm trying to make is, I don't understand how you could, and you can channel your inner Joe Henrik here if you want to, but how you can make the argument that there's cultural evolution and that you would not expect there to be any biological evolution. That is, why isn't there Baldwinian evolution? If this is the, if the EEA for the psychology is a cultural one, right?
Yeah.
Then people who start off with a disposition towards essentialism will do better than those who are, you know, blank slates to start off with and culture has to write them.
Yeah, so that was my main hypothesis, in the sense that, like, cultural, like, whatever version of the story that you entertain, like, even the first one where you said, like, it's a deep, genetically evolved intuition, like, if it's at all specific to something like ethno-linguistic categories, then it needs that cultural evolutionary process. So already that one is a version of this Baldwin kind of argument, right?
Yeah.
And so the main reason, incentives being what they are, the main reason to be skeptical about the possibility of that feedback loop on genetic evolution would be if you thought that this was a fairly recent phenomena, or that cultural evolution produced such diverse kinds of structures in the world that they didn't map on very well to anything particularly, like, about language specifically. That, for example, we had corporate kin groups that were much more important, and, you know, for our relations to others and for structuring information, that didn't map onto language differences. So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why you might, I mean, I'm a hyper-adaptationist at heart, I mean, but there are a lot of reasons why you might have constraints on the ability to kind of genetically evolve the psychology as well. So, yeah, constraints on genetic evolution, recency of the culturally evolved environment, and a culturally evolved environment that's not quite exactly what we might picture it in terms of, like, what the ethnographic present looks like, would be the three.
Okay.
And even the ethnographic present, I mean, actually, we're kind of moving away from the ethnographic present to make this claim about the ethnographic past, because we know from the ethnographic present that you can have people who speak basically the same language, like Serbs and Croatians, who hate each other, right? And so clearly things like religious differences take the place regularly of linguistic differences in structuring a lot of intergroup behavior. Yeah. So that was my starting hypothesis anyway, and a strong one, but difficult to test.
All right, well, we are actually out of time. So
Okay.